The mind chatter says I didn't get enough done today.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says maybe I'll get an agent.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says you still have too many unread emails.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, how am I ever going to get all this work done?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, how will I ever have time once school starts to do the things I love?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, wouldn't I love school? Why am I doing it otherwise?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I have amazing friends who want to spontaneously celebrate me. Why is that so hard to find in a partner?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I didn't spend enough time outside in the sun today.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I will never get everything done.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, how will I ever get what I need?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, it's already so close to the end of the world.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, what if these aren't the right thoughts?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I wonder how Papa's doing.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I wonder if I've made enough progress to deserve love.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, these glasses are really cute.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, it bothers me that I have 19 piercings instead of 20.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, was it already over a year ago that I had appendicitis?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I really, really nailed the ending of my novel.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I really love the sun.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, did I eat enough today?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, did I eat too late? Did I eat too much? Did I eat the right things?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I should text my sister.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I'm going to have to spend some more time at the Sprint store this week.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, this is a very comfortable couch.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, I hope it's not as dreadfully hot tonight as it was last night.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, it doesn't get hot here.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, why is it so hard to find a box fan?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter says, oh, I hope this video works out. I'm not very tech savvy and I don't really know how to do these types of things that make it look all fancy. And should it look fancy? What does fancy mean? Am I a fancy person? I do like fancy. I like dressing up fancy and going to fancy places and having fancy phone cases and doing all sorts of fancy things. But is my definition of fancy different than other people's? And what purpose does fancy serve? Does it need a purpose? Can I just have fun being fancy?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter thinks vague thoughts about my therapist.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter thinks I should probably plan a retreat.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter remembers that I have this weird cycle of being very sure that I'm going to do all these things as soon as I'm done with this one thing. And then, when I'm done with the thing I'm presently doing, I don't want to do any of the things that were distracting me.
Thank you for sharing.
Mind chatter wonders who's in the kitchen.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter tells me that this thing being behind me is actually uncomfortable. This thing being a blanket.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter notices and remembers when I was in London 11 years ago.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter really wishes that I could have enjoyed that gallivant all across Europe when I was in my early 20s.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter reminds me that that would require being present, and that's one of the things that you most fear.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter tries to figure out what is so scary about being present. Does it mean that you will have to fully embrace something that you will most definitely lose because the moment is always changing? And it's hard to stay inside something that is always changing because the other word for change is loss.
Thank you for sharing.
Mind chatter wonders, is the only other word for change loss?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter wonders, what is so scary about loss that I would essentially build an entire personality around avoiding ever having anything to lose?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter would like to remind me that it's actually not possible to never have anything.
Thank you for sharing.
Mind chatter explains, because you will always have thoughts, you will always have yourself, you will always have your body until you don't. There will always be things that you have that inevitably means that you will lose because all of life is temporary.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter is getting sucked down a rabbit hole of philosophy, which is another way of coping.
Thank you for sharing.
Mind chatter worries that I'm not making any sense.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter wonders, what pictures should I use for my profiles?
Thank you for sharing.
There were so many good ones. It was so much fun. And yet, I couldn't be present for the fun.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter is now very sure that this doesn't make sense to anyone outside this.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter is very concerned with being understood, validated, and agreed with, because to not have those things is a threat to survival.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter is tired. Would like a rest.
Thank you for sharing.
But then the mind chatter thinks about all of the things that there is to think about. Which one is the right one? Which one is the most beneficial? Which one will get me what I want? Which one will help you?
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter remembers how much growth has happened, remembers how I was even last year.
Thank you for sharing.
And then the mind chatter remembers, well, there have been some old Megan moments this year as well.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter wants to apologize once again to the friends that I've blown up at.
Thank you for sharing.
Because, as the mind chatter explains, I have not actually forgiven myself.
Thank you for sharing.
The The mind chatter says, and that means that you've put yourself above God.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter is very nervous about mentioning God. Doesn't want to alienate anyone.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter thinks I'm very codependent.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter thinks that the mind chatter is right.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter thinks, and now we have reached mind chatter inception.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter has whirling, non-specific thoughts.
Thank you for sharing.
The mind chatter is ready to call it a night.
Thank you for sharing.